toxic woman of Riverside, Gloria Ramirez. I've read some strange case files over the years. Patients who bled blue, people who swore their hearts beat on the wrong side. But nothing compares to what happened in Riverside, California in 1994. It was late on February 19th, just another shift in the emergency room at Riverside General Hospital, until a woman was wheeled through the doors, gasping for breath. Her name was Gloria Ramirez, 31 years old, mother of 2, recently diagnosed with advanced cervical cancer. The nurses remembered her as quiet, polite, barely able to speak through the pain. What none of them could have known was that, within minutes of her arrival, the entire emergency room would collapse around her. It started simple. A routine treatment for respiratory distress. Oxygen, IV line, cardiac monitor. But when the first nurse drew blood, something went wrong, very wrong. The syringe filled with oily, brownish fluid, and a strange ammonia-like smell spread through the air. A nurse frowned and leaned closer. The odor grew stronger, metallic, chemical, almost sweet. Then she staggered. Seconds later, she fainted. Another nurse tried to catch her and dropped beside her. The resident physician felt dizzy next. Within minutes, 6 hospital staff were unconscious on the floor. One doctor's skin turned bluish. Another began shaking uncontrollably. Someone shouted, "Evacuate the ER." Imagine that, an emergency room abandoning a patient because her body was making people sick. They pushed her gurney into an isolation bay, doors sealed, ventilation cranked to max. Outside, paramedics and doctors gasped for clean air while the smell clung to their clothes. A young medical student whispered the question that would haunt every investigator for years. What's coming out of her? It's hard to picture what panic looks like in a place that's built for emergencies. The ER is supposed to be controlled chaos, adrenaline, yes, but always with order. That night, though, Riverside General became something else. The line between medicine and horror blurred in real time. When Gloria Ramirez was brought in around 8:15, she was conscious but fading fast. Her heartbeat was erratic, her breathing shallow, her skin covered in a strange, oily sheen. The attending physician, Dr. Humberto Ochoa, began resuscitation protocols immediately. Nurses Susan Kane and Maureen Welch moved in to assist. And then came the first clue that this was no ordinary medical emergency. As Nurse Kane inserted the IV, she noticed a peculiar smell, not the usual odor of illness or antiseptic, but something sharp, chemical, almost like garlic mixed with ammonia. When she drew blood, the syringe filled with brownish liquid that shimmered under the fluorescent lights. "It smells like ammonia," she said. But before anyone could respond, she stumbled backward, dizzy. Seconds later, she collapsed. Another nurse, Maureen Welch, reached to steady her and immediately complained of nausea and burning in her face. "Something's wrong with the air," she said, before dropping beside her co-worker. Then Dr. Julie Gorchinsky, the resident, started to feel it too. Her vision blurred, her body tingled, and she gasped for air before fainting. Within 10 minutes, 6 people had fallen. The ER filled with confusion, doctors shouting, equipment clattering, stretchers rolling as others tried to move the fallen staff out of the room. Witnesses later described it as a chain reaction of collapse, one person going down after another like dominoes. Some vomited, others twitched. Some were barely breathing. They evacuated the entire emergency department. Every patient, every nurse, every doctor, the hospital staff who remained donned protective gowns and masks as if they were facing a chemical spill. The only ones who stayed behind with Gloria were Dr. Ochoa and a handful of volunteers wearing makeshift protection, surgical masks taped around their faces, plastic over their eyes. The strange thing was, none of the instruments showed contamination. No smoke, no gas leak, no unusual readings on the monitors. Just that thick, metallic odor clinging to everything. Outside, paramedics lay on stretchers, oxygen masks over their faces, while police cordoned off the building. The hospital declared an internal disaster code, something reserved for mass casualty events. It wasn't because of a shooting or explosion. It was because a single woman's body was somehow releasing something so toxic. It took down nearly everyone who tried to save her. Dr. Ochoa kept working on her anyway. He said later that the look in her eyes stayed with him forever, part pain, part confusion, like she was trapped between worlds. At 8:50 Maca, despite everything, Gloria Ramirez was pronounced dead. But the terror didn't end when her heart stopped, because whatever was inside her was still spreading. The moment Gloria Ramirez was pronounced dead, the ER fell completely silent. You could almost hear the fluorescent lights humming, but outside those glass doors, chaos was just beginning. More than 23 people were showing symptoms: nausea, shortness of breath, fainting, even temporary paralysis. They'd all been near her: paramedics, clerks, interns. The hospital's hazardous materials team was called in, and Riverside General declared a full quarantine. Everyone in the emergency wing was ordered to leave. The hospital staff, still dazed and dizzy, staggered into the parking lot under the cold February air. Some vomited on the pavement, others leaned against ambulances, gasping through oxygen masks. A nurse named Maureen Welch woke up in a trauma bay outside, with no idea how she'd gotten there. "All I remember," she later said, "is the smell, like garlic and metal." Inside, the few who stayed behind sealed the ER with plastic sheets and turned on industrial fans to ventilate the space. But the odor wouldn't fade. It clung to every surface: walls, curtains, even the monitors. It was like the room itself had absorbed it. By 11 p.m., a hazmat team arrived in full suits, the kind used for chemical or radioactive leaks. They combed the area with detectors, testing for ammonia, hydrogen sulfide, any kind of toxic gas. Nothing. The air was clean, the equipment sterile, the readings normal. Yet every person who had been near Gloria had the same symptoms. They moved her body into an isolation chamber, sealed in a lead-lined coffin, and transported it to the Riverside County Coroner's office. The pathologist refused to begin the autopsy until they could ensure it was safe. They stored her in a special containment room, her remains literally treated as a biohazard. Meanwhile, the surviving staff were taken to another hospital for observation. Dr. Julie Gorczynski spent 2 weeks in intensive care, suffering from tremors, breathing problems, and a condition that damaged her bone marrow. Another nurse developed hepatitis and a vascular necrosis in her knees. It wasn't psychological. Their blood work showed chemical abnormalities. Whatever they had been exposed to, it was real. Investigators from the California Department of Health and Human Services launched an immediate inquiry. They interviewed everyone, analyzed samples from the ER, swabbed the walls, even examined the uniforms worn that night. Yet every test came back inconclusive. No toxic substance, no leak, no contamination. Nothing that could explain why one woman's body had turned an entire emergency department into a biological disaster zone. By dawn, the story had leaked to the press. The headlines the next morning were surreal. The toxic lady of Riverside. ER staff collapses after treating patient. Reporters swarmed the hospital parking lot, flashing cameras through the fences. The public wanted answers. Was this a chemical weapon, an unknown disease, or something even stranger? No one knew yet, but every person who had been there that night agreed on one thing. It wasn't normal. And in the morgue, beneath layers of sealed plastic and metal, Gloria Ramirez still waited, her body quietly exhaling whatever mystery had begun that night. The Riverside County Coroner's Office had handled thousands of cases before, but none like this. The technicians refused to even touch Gloria Ramirez's body until they were guaranteed it was safe. For days, her remains sat sealed inside an airtight containment chamber, refrigerated and double-wrapped in layers of plastic. It would take 6 days before the first autopsy began, and even then, the pathologists wore full-body protective suits and respirators. When they finally opened the chamber, that same chemical odor filled the room, faint but unmistakable. One technician described it as sweet and metallic, almost like fruit mixed with bleach. Her skin was slick with an oily film, and strange crystals glistened on her clothing. They were translucent, like tiny shards of glass. No one could explain where they came from. They took blood and tissue samples immediately. The results stunned the lab. Her blood contained dimethyl sulfone, a chemical derived from dimethyl sulfoxide, better known as DMSO, a solvent sometimes used in industrial cleaners and alternative medicine. It's not usually lethal, but in large amounts, it can cause the body to excrete a garlic-like odor. And DMSO is known for leaving an oily residue on the skin, the same kind the doctors reported that night. But that still didn't explain why everyone in the ER had collapsed. Investigators discovered something strange. Under certain conditions, dimethyl sulfoxide, DMSO, can transform into dimethyl sulfate, DMS, a highly toxic gas that attacks the lungs, eyes, and nervous system. It's used in chemical warfare research. All it takes is oxygen, electricity, and the right temperature. Inside a hospital emergency room filled with oxygen tanks, electrical defibrillators, and intense lighting, the conditions were perfect. If Gloria Ramirez had been self-medicating with DMSO, something that was sometimes sold in the 1990s as a home remedy for pain, it might have built up in her tissues. When the paramedics and doctors administered oxygen and electric shocks, they could have unknowingly triggered a chemical chain reaction inside her body. In other words, Gloria's body became a toxic factory, producing a gas that poisoned everyone nearby. It sounded insane, like science fiction. But the more chemists studied it, the more plausible it seemed. In fact, tests on her blood confirmed elevated levels of sulfur compounds, exactly what you'd expect if DMSO had converted to DMS. Still, not everyone believed the theory. Some experts argued the DMSO levels found were too low to cause such severe effects. Others suggested the staff had suffered a mass psychogenic illness, a kind of shared physical reaction caused by fear and stress, not chemicals. But that explanation fell apart when blood tests confirmed genuine chemical damage in several victims, including Dr. Julie Gorkinski, whose white blood cells and red blood cells showed signs of oxidative injury, consistent with a toxin exposure. The official report released months later by the California Department of Health and Human Services concluded that the DMSO to DMS chain reaction was the most likely explanation. It was, they said, a rare and tragic convergence of chemistry and circumstance. But some people in Riverside, including Gloria's own family, didn't buy it. They said she never used DMSO. They believed the hospital was hiding something, a chemical leak, a mishandled experiment, maybe even radiation exposure from contaminated equipment. The coroner's office denied it all. Still, the facts were undeniable. Something had transformed her body into a source of poison. And the scariest part wasn't that it happened once. It was that, technically, it could happen again. In the weeks after Gloria Ramirez's death, Riverside General Hospital looked more like a research facility than a place of healing. Investigators in hazmat suits sealed off the emergency wing. Ventilation systems were replaced, every surface scrubbed with industrial-grade cleaners. But for the people who were there that night, the smell never really went away. Nurse Susan Kane, the first to faint, returned to work after a few days, but said she couldn't stand the scent of rubbing alcohol anymore. It made her nauseous. She started wearing a mask long before the world knew what masks felt like. Dr. Julie Gorkinski, who spent the longest time inside the ER, wasn't as lucky. She developed chronic breathing problems and tremors that lasted for years. Her bone marrow was damaged, and parts of her femur literally began to die, a condition called avascular necrosis. She would later say, "It changed my life forever. I walked into that room a doctor. I left it a patient." The staff filed lawsuits against Riverside County, claiming the hospital had exposed them to something deadly and then covered it up. But every lab test, every inspection came back clean. No leaks, no chemical residue, no hidden experiments. Just the same unanswered question. What was coming out of Gloria Ramirez's body that night? Her family demanded answers too. They described her as gentle, caring, and devoted to her children. She had been battling cancer for months, using pain creams and home remedies, maybe even DMSO ointments, to ease her symptoms. But they refused to believe she caused her own death or the sickness of others. To them, Gloria wasn't the toxic lady. She was a victim of something larger, something the world wasn't ready to understand. And maybe they were right, because the final report, as detailed as it was, left gaps. No one could replicate the chemical reaction under lab conditions. No one could explain why the concentration of toxins varied so drastically between blood samples. No one could explain why, in that one small ERI, at that one precise moment, The laws of chemistry seem to bend. Scientists still debate the case. Some think it was DMSO oxidation gone wrong. Others whisper darker theories. Accidental contamination, illegal lab materials transported through medical waste, even secret military compounds being tested nearby. Every theory fits just enough to sound possible, and none fit completely enough to be true. For those who lived it, though, no theory changes what they saw. The smell, the fainting, the bodies on the floor, and the look on Gloria's face before she died. Confused, pleading as if she somehow knew something terrible was happening that none of them could stop. After her death, her body was held for nearly 2 months before being released to her family, who buried her in a simple coffin in Riverside. The staff refused to attend the funeral, not out of disrespect, out of fear. Some said the odor still lingered in their memories, so vividly that they worried breathing near her grave might bring it back. It's been decades since that night, but even now, people in Riverside lower their voices when they talk about her. Her case has been studied in medical schools, dissected in documentaries, debated in labs, but never truly solved, because no matter how many equations you write or tests you run, you can't explain how a human body became toxic to everyone who tried to save it, and why. It's strange, isn't it? How a single night in a small California hospital could still terrify scientists 30 years later. Gloria Ramirez didn't come in carrying a weapon or a disease or some supernatural curse. She came in like thousands of patients before her, scared, in pain, just wanting to breathe. And somehow, she became the most toxic person in medical history. Maybe that's what makes this story so unsettling. Because if the experts couldn't explain what happened inside that ER, what does that say about how little we really understand about our own bodies? About how a living person could turn into a chemical reaction so violent that it dropped trained doctors to their knees. Theories come and go. DMSO, dimethyl sulfate, hysteria, cover-ups. But none of them erase the fact that something real happened that night. Something that shouldn't have been possible. The air itself betrayed them. The survivors still talk about it in whispers. How the smell clung to their skin. How their eyes burned for days. How they could still hear the sound of the heart monitor beeping, slowing, until it was gone. They say the ER never felt the same again, like the building remembered. And somewhere under the soil in Riverside, there's a grave with Gloria's name on it. Visitors sometimes leave flowers there, not out of fear, but out of respect for a woman who, for reasons no one can fully explain, became a mystery that science still can't solve. Maybe that's the real horror here. Not that she was toxic, but that she was human, just like us. If stories like this fascinate you, real cases where science meets the unexplainable, make sure you subscribe to Last Seen and turn on notifications. Every week, we uncover another story that proves the world is stranger than we're willing to admit.